Welcome, everyone, both at home watching this on YouTube and those who are present in the room, to our next session of our History at Newcastle seminar series. We are in week 8, at the pointy end of the semester, but we still have a fairly full program ahead of us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that virtually I am present on the unceded land of the Pamalung clan of the Wabakal people. And I'd like to pay respects to their elders, past and present, and pay respects to those who are virtually, wherever you may be, to those lands and countries that have been so generous to us. So today it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Andrew Park from the University of Hong Kong. Dr. Park is a lecturer in, of all places, the School of Public Health, but has done work on a number of other historical topics of European relations, and has a very lovely CV, and is sorry as I pull up the information here, and has recently come out with a book on Sarah Wambaugh, and that is the subject for today's talk. So actually, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, Andrew, and so today we'll be hearing about a career in democracy, Sarah Wambaugh, and the turbulent history of the plebiscite. So without any further ado, and with that very brief introduction, I might pass it off to you, Andrew, to take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Ryan, for that introduction. And thank you for all those attending and listening. So, yeah, my talk today is on actually my forthcoming book. I'll just show the screen. So I haven't quite got it in my hands yet, but apparently it's coming out end of this year or early next year. And I want to give a little bit of a taste about who Sarah Wambaugh was, why her career in plebiscites was particularly salient to today's contemporary world. And I'm going to do that by basically presenting a few of the overarching themes that kind of her career as a whole and the use of the plebiscite in the first half of the 20th century kind of speak to. And then I'm going to give an outline of that career, the early years of that career. And then I want to focus on the talk on two moments that kind of encapsulate a lot of her, maybe the themes of her life and career and some of the challenges. And that is the Saar plebiscite. This is a big operation that Sarah Wambaugh was involved in 1935. And then later, towards the end of her life and career, she did election monitoring in Greece in 1946. So I will get started with what this kind of person, why Sarah Wambaugh and her career is important, why it is relevant for thinking about things in today's world. And part of the reason for that is the book and her life speaks to this tension between expertise and politics on the one hand. So throughout her life, she always had this tension between being an expert and being political. And this played out in a number of ways, not altogether without some tension and problems. And there's also this, she's of particular interest in today's world because of her kind of pioneering role as a woman in international affairs and international relations. She bucked the trend in many ways. She had a career that was quite important, and in a very political sense. So she wasn't involved in things that at the time are considered, the soft areas of international affairs for women, including, social welfare, the role of women and children in international affairs. She was involved in the kind of pointy end of politics and conflict with her work in the plebiscite. So she's of interest in that sense. And then, of course, she's of interest, the plebiscite as a whole is very fascinating because it speaks to this tension between what is the role of democracy and the people's voice in international affairs. And then wrapped up in all of that is maybe some underlying points about political institutions, how our perceptions of these change over time, and what role that plays. But overall, I think her career is simply fascinating. She had a very dramatic career at times, and that's what I am going to share. So to begin with, what is a plebiscite? What do I mean by plebiscite? Well, you can think of it as a referendum. That's another word that's basically synonymous with it. At the time, the word plebiscite is what is used, and a plebiscite is, in the context that I'm speaking of, a vote on sovereignty, a vote on what sovereignty a given territory, should have. And its origins go back to Roman times. There are a number of plebiscites, not necessarily about sovereignty, but its modern use in terms of deciding questions of sovereignty goes back to the French Revolution. Um, there were some interesting operations held in the late 18th century after the revolution, but then it becomes discredited. This tool gets used and abused by lots of statesmen in the middle of the 19th century. And by the end of the 19th century, this technique is largely discredited. People have kind of ignored it, or they think it's a fraud. So that's a kind of rough outline of where the plebiscite are when Sarah Wambaugh enters the picture. So there's the picture of Sarah Wambaugh as a student. She was born in Ohio in 1882, but she grew up in Boston. And she grew up there because she is the daughter of, at the time, a very eminent Harvard law professor, Professor Eugene Wambaugh, international law professor. So that maybe speaks to some of her interest in these topics. She grew up in a household discussing all of these questions, and she studies at Radcliffe College, which today is part of Harvard University. It was then the women's, as Harvard wasn't, was a male-only institution until some time. This was the kind of women's college affiliated with Harvard. And she studies international politics and, international law and these kind of questions. Unsurprisingly, for an educated woman at this time, she is very active in the cause of suffrage, and she's active in the domestic struggle for American women's suffrage. She's a member of various, politically oriented parties in that sense, and always we can say the kind of middle class, liberal approaches to these issues. She's not a radical. She's not a left wing. She's a very centrist, what you might say, center right, maybe in terms of these struggles. So white women are her kind of friends in these things. She's not terribly socially aware, you might say, in some sense, but definitely very politically aware. The First World War breaks out, and she joins the Women's Peace Party, which is an organization formed by some of the members of the American women's suffrage movement, Jane Addams, for example, and others. And she is basically part of this very idealistic vision, which suggests that international politics can be run on very different lines. And this is the kind of protean sense that we need some world organization, a League of Nations, for example, and we need to, basically run the world along lines that are, going to create peace and prosperity for everyone and so on. This is a kind of protean liberal internationalist platform. She herself is very active in this movement. She's the executive secretary of the Massachusetts branch, and that was actually one of the most active branches of the Women's Peace Party. So of interest to the story of the plebiscite is that she gets a lot of organizational experience running what you would call propaganda campaigns. She's out on Boston Common advocating for a League of Nations and all of these kind of things. And it's during this time that she also makes connections with lots of other organizations, including, the Union for Democratic Control in the UK, which is also pushing for a similar platform. And it's during this time that she gets interested in plebiscites. And so what is the role of the plebiscite during this time? Well, in the First World War, it is still a fairly marginalized technique, but because of this radical enthusiasm for creating a new world that is more democratic, that is more fair, that is more free, the plebiscite appeals to radical and left-wing kind of advocates as the most democratic way to resolve territorial issues. And it's largely within these radical circles that discussion about the plebiscite takes place. And in particular, Alsace-Lorraine, the territory taken from France by Germany in 1870. And there's a lot of discussion that maybe we should hold a plebiscite there. And, this could be something that we could use a plebiscite for. It's discussed mainly there, but also in the case of Schleswig, which is between Germany and Denmark, because Prussia had taken that territory from Denmark in the 1860s. And so there was these two unresolved cases of tension where it was speculated that a plebiscite might be held, but fairly limited to these two possible cases. But then the war ends. The Paris Peace Conference takes place in 1919, and actually the plebiscite becomes at least a fairly common device in the diplomacy. So there's something about 13, maybe 14 areas that are discussed and mooted for plebiscites during the Paris Peace Conference. And it's not just Alsace-Lorraine and Schleswig. In fact, Alsace-Lorraine, they quickly decide, well, it's just going to go to France, so we're not going to have a plebiscite. But it's discussed as a way to resolve tension. But it's actually used in a very instrumental way in the Paris Peace Conference. It's not used in a sense that, do we really want to find out which, people want to live in this area, or do we want to hold a plebiscite because Britain and France can't decide on how to draw this borderline? And that's usually how that plebiscite comes about. It's kind of a result of some bargaining. In the end, there's only about 6 plebiscites that are actually attempted after the Paris Peace Conference in 1920, 1921. And those are in this map, and this map, is part of my forthcoming book, and so I'm flashing it about because I've paid enough money for it, so I'm gonna make use of all my cartographical expenses. But you can see that there was basically only used plebiscites in defeated countries, in Germany and Austria. And so those are the areas where the Allies can get away with this. They don't have to, awkwardly hold a plebiscite in their own territory, as in France, perhaps, but we just hold plebiscites in the now defeated areas. Of these operations, they are not necessarily very smooth. Some are, and you can see, for example, in East Prussia, in Marienwerder and Allenstein, these regions are fairly rural, and the plebiscite is fairly straightforward. Same with Schleswig, this plebiscite in Denmark. It goes fairly peacefully, no real trouble. Similarly, the ones in Austria might be a little bit more tense, but they turn out all right. But unfortunately, the Central European ones in Teschen and in neighboring Upper Silesia turn out to be really violent and messy. And so the reputation of the plebiscite really disintegrates very quickly after this moment, tied up with Woodrow Wilson's call for self-determination. That moment, you might call the plebiscite moment, ends very quickly because it ends up taking something like 30,000 Allied French, British, and Italian troops to kind of pacify Upper Silesia. There's terrorist campaigns in Teschen. The plebiscite in Teschen is ultimately cancelled. In Teschen, Orava, and Spiš because there's, too much violence. And so the plebiscite gets a very bad reputation as not being a democratic solution to questions of sovereignty, but actually just a cause of chaos. And we know the reputation collapses because in the final post-war treaty that is negotiated in Lausanne in 1923 between the European powers and Turkey, totally repudiates the plebiscite. And in fact, it's at that moment where it really embraces the radical opposite of plebiscite, which is population transfer. And you have the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon, at this time, is very vocal during the negotiations, condemning the plebiscite and saying that however bad, forced population transfer might be, it's still, a better alternative. So it's at that moment where the plebiscite is seen as as having failed so badly that it's better just to just wholesale move people instead of letting them decide. So that's the first kind of rise and fall of the plebiscite. We could probably end the story there if it wasn't for Sarah Wambaugh. So what does Sarah Wambaugh do? Well, during this time, she is still in the US. She's teaching at Radcliffe College, but she writes her first book, a monograph on plebiscites, in time for the Paris Peace Conference. So she sends a draft, apparently, which, according to one source, Woodrow Wilson at least has with him at one point. I'm not sure how much he read it. But she is commissioned to write this in 1917 when the US begins the war, begins to join the war by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And she writes this fairly well-received book, a very detailed study of the 19th century plebiscites. And it's that which gets her into this field. And so she already has a very good reputation as one of the chief experts in the plebiscites by the time the Paris Peace Conference is held, and certainly after when the book is formally published. And she builds on that. So in 1922, she visits all of these plebiscite zones that I showed on the map, which is only in some cases a year or less than a year after these areas were beset by violence and, were very tense, war-torn areas. And so on the one hand, this is remarkable because, it's some off the beaten places, you might say, going up to these areas. And also she's traveling more or less independently, which is also something, given her gender, this is quite, a bold thing to do. And she just gets on and does it. And if you see in her archives, which are all in the Schlesinger Library in Radcliffe College, you can still find her little notebooks with her dense scrawl of, all of her notes and details of visiting these plebiscite zones. And so that's one approach she's doing. She's still trying to get material for her next book that she's going to write on the First World War plebiscites. But she's also involved in international affairs in another way. So in 1920, she, after she submits her book on the monograph on plebiscite, she goes to the UK and she studies more or less formally or informally in, I believe, the London School of Economics. And then she gets an offer to join as a temporary member the new Secretariat of the League of Nations. And she joins it when, before it's even moved to Geneva. So it's really very nascent. She joins when it's still in London, when they're basically sorting things out to move to Geneva at the end of 1920. And this, we saw she's a member of the Women's Peace Party. She's already inclined towards liberal internationalism. But this moment in the Secretariat basically totally convinces her, and she becomes a lifelong advocate and enthusiast. To really passionate degrees. You see in some of her writing, some of her, talks she gives, some quotes, for example, include, "God bless the League of Nations." Another quote is, "My heart is with the League of Nations always," these kind of things. So she's a very extreme advocate, and there's lots of Americans enthusiasts at the time, and she's definitely, one of those. But she takes this advocacy work very seriously. So after her 6 months in the League Secretariat, where she is in the Minorities and Administrative Commission section, it's called. And if anyone is interested in the League, that's the section of the Secretariat where Eric Kolban, who creates these minority system, is. And she's looking at those sensitive questions like Belgian, German, border areas where they don't hold a plebiscite, but the Belgians kind of have a head count where they say, like, "We took your territory. Are you fine with that?" And the Germans have to say, well, yes or no, but there's nothing they can do about it. So she's looking at those questions, which the League of Nations is looking at. She's looking at a number of these minority kind of cases there. When she finishes work for the League of Nations in end of 1920, she goes back to the United States and she's a full-time advocate, basically, for the League of Nations. She teaches at Wellesley College for a semester and basically finds that this interferes with her work promoting American entry to the League of Nations. And so she gives up that job. She gets a kind of research fellow job at Radcliffe College, and she's giving lots of talks. And she's actually, again, really quite a prominent speaker and one of, I suppose, certainly the most prominent woman speaker in this still fairly male-dominated domain. One example is the Institute of Politics, which is this international relations forum held in Williamstown in Massachusetts at a college there. And this forum every year attracts some high-profile people, and she becomes the first woman to speak at this forum, and her talks are very well attended. Because she has firsthand experience of working in the League Secretariat, as well as this historical knowledge of European conflict. And so she's a leading scholar at this time, actually already well respected. I put an example of one of the flyers from her talks, and you can see there she's a pretty bold looking lady at this time, wearing her fur coat, and her appearance is certainly pretty striking. And she's at this point decided that she'd rather dedicate her life to just trying to get America to enter the League of Nations. And she's going on a speaking tour across the country in the US. She visits, 30 towns, talking to various people and so on. One of her main selling points and one of the main reasons she advocates for the League and that she likes it so much is her sense that the League of Nations represents this new scientific approach to international politics. And she herself is a convinced political scientist. She feels that political science is the way to basically is the future of international relations, that countries are going to be able to resolve their questions in this impartial, scientific manner, and that the League of Nations and the Secretariat of the League of Nations is the best way to do this. And she calls the Secretariat kind of the first time that political science has been called in to resolve the world's problems. And so she's very much playing to this American, I guess, ideal of science, this is the era of scientific management, of all of these things. So science is the, zeitgeist. So that's her career. She would happily have focused on advocating for the League of Nations, but then something else happens. Then she has this opportunity to go quite far away to the west coast of South America to basically be involved in a plebiscite in Tacna Arica. And so this is a dispute between Peru and Chile, which goes back to the late 19th century when Chile invaded Peru and Bolivia, seized these territories shown on the map. But part of the peace treaty said that Chile would have a plebiscite after 10 years. And of course, this is the 19th century, 10 years goes by, no plebiscite. A similar case to what happens with Germany and Schleswig when they had seized that territory. They had promised a plebiscite, never held it. And so this dispute between the two countries, Peru and Chile, goes on and spoils their relations for a long time. But after the First World War, there's this new spirit of conciliation. And so they decide that we will get the United States to be the arbiter of this dispute. And so the United States, under Calvin Coolidge, makes this decision saying, as the arbiter, we're finally going to go ahead and we're going to hold this plebiscite. And so this is, for Sarah Wambaugh, this is the first time that she will actually have seen a plebiscite up close. She's read about them, she's studied them, she's visited the areas after they're held, but this is the first time that she gets to witness one. And so she goes to Peru. She's made a technical advisor for the Peruvian government. So she's not impartial. She's definitely committed to the Peruvian cause. And she has a pretty, how can we say it, a pretty turbulent time witnessing this. So The problem with this plebiscite is that the Chileans are in total control of this territory. They haven't given up any power. They've said that, yeah, we'll hold a plebiscite, but their troops are still on the ground, and they control all the kind of levers of government. And so the Peruvians really don't have a chance to promote their cause very much, even if the local population might be sympathetic. They aren't even allowed to live on shore in this town of Arica on the coast. And so they end up living on the Peruvian supply ship. And that's the one pictured here. This is the Ucayali, the Peruvian ship where Sarah Wambaugh ends up living for basically 10 months, not quite 10 months. And that's itself kind of a remarkable feat. Most political scientists don't anticipate living on a kind of supply ship for that long, but she is totally committed to this cause at this time. So when they make visits to the shore, for example, the Peruvian delegation, she goes with them. She witnesses, for example, a mob of kind of men beating the Peruvian delegates. She herself is involved in very kind of hairy situations where the Chilean secret police or the kind of nationalist organizations at one point basically stop her car, and she and her colleagues are driving to a remote town to try and advocate the Peruvian cause, and they stop the car and basically drag everyone out. They beat up the local Peruvians in the car, and they narrowly escape, and all of these things. So she witnesses some pretty rough scenes about what you might say self-determination is often about, this raw violence between two groups. And she is particularly struck by the fact that this plebiscite should be held at all under such conditions, which are so appalling. And so this is something that, some people, it might make them just not want to be involved in any more plebiscites at all. For example, the American head of this American commission that is supposed to be running this operation between the two sides is actually General Pershing, the former army general leading American troops in the First World War. And he corresponds with Wambaugh and afterwards and says, I never want to be involved in another operation like this. God, this was terrible and all these things. But for Sarah Wambaugh, of course, this was just an opportunity or more of an incentive to make the plebiscite actually a useful tool. And so she dives into this task by, even when she's aboard her ship, when she is helping the Peruvian cause, her main work is looking through the European plebiscites after the First World War and trying to shape normative conclusions about, how a plebiscite should be run. And so she's telling the Peruvians that, well, in the Schleswig plebiscite, we did X, Y, Z. And in the Klagenfurt plebiscite in Austria, they did, X, Y, Z. And she's trying to build up, I guess, case knowledge to convince the plebiscite authorities that the Chilean troops should be withdrawn, that the area should be neutralized. And this becomes her big focus, normative focus, is that neutralization is what is required for a plebiscite, and that if there's not neutralization, there's no point holding a plebiscite. And she basically is writing her normative prescriptions while in this conflict zone, while aboard the ship or while she's back in Lima, writing up reports. She is crafting what eventually becomes her major work on plebiscites. And so the plebiscite in Tacna Arica, by 1926, it's very clear it's not going anywhere. Eventually, it's abandoned. And this is quite distressing. And for a while, Sarah Wambaugh is committed to carrying on the Peruvian cause. And she even writes to her colleagues suggesting that she open up a kind of souvenir store in New York to advocate for Peru. And she says, I could sell, llama rugs and things like that, and we could keep the cause going. And, eventually she decided it's better not to sell, Peruvian tourist trinkets to promote Peru, but become the scholar again, writing about the plebiscites. And so she turns her focus to what eventually becomes plebiscites since the World War. published in 1933. I have, of course, bought my own version at some point, so I'll just show off. This is her one of her two volumes of this book. So it's a very monumental work. It's probably, I don't know, 700 pages or something more, maybe 1,000. I'm not entirely sure. But she goes through and analyzes all of the World War, post First World War plebiscites. And importantly, by the end of this book, she has narrowed down the normative principles of this to a set of 18 points. And the 18 points are listed, numbered by the end of this book. And this is some normative points that actually you read a lot in the future. In a lot of cases, which I'll cover in a moment, these 18 points kind of pop up throughout discussions because they're a very concise, normative set of requirements, and they're easy for policymakers to kind of access, and they're discussed by the Foreign Office in the UK, and they're discussed by League of Nations people, and later United Nations, and so on. So these 18 points are, I guess, the distillation of her thinking about what is required for a plebiscite. And what those 18 points do is it's all about basically the total neutralization of the plebiscite zone. And in fact, it's remarkable. She calls for a radical temporary form of international government. She effectively says that in the 6 months or so, at least before a plebiscite, hopefully more, all of the local authorities should be kind of under the control of an international body. She doesn't name the League of Nations directly, but this is implied by her. She calls for an international police force. She calls for all of these kind of apparatus of international government, of a temporary international authority. She also, unsurprisingly, calls for, in the last of her points, that a fair plebiscite must include women's suffrage. And that's important because the Tacna Arica plebiscite, for example, didn't have women's suffrage. And that's something that really rankles with her. All of the First World War plebiscites ended up having women's suffrage. And so that's something she points to as an argument saying, look, women's participation in votes on sovereignty is already established after the First World War. So this should be part of the normative prescriptions. This is a result of her thinking as a kind of political scientist. She is very much committed to these kind of ideas of the technical aspect of holding a plebiscite. What is the technical way to make it free and fair? And for Wambaugh, that is neutralization. But she doesn't cover, and she kind of ignores many of the political aspects of a plebiscite, which are fairly basic. She doesn't cover, for example, why you should hold a plebiscite in the region you're holding it. She just says, well, that's just decided by the powerful people deciding on the plebiscite. She doesn't really speculate on whether it should be held as a unit or whether you should have a plebiscite by individual voting districts. She says, well, again, that should be decided by whoever is deciding on the plebiscite. So she kind of eschews these political dimensions of the plebiscite in favor of the technical dimensions. And that kind of narrowness is something which will have consequences. One thing that is fascinating about her normative principles is she does understand the importance of perception. So she is very much focused on the psychology of voters. And she says, look, in order for someone to vote free and fairly, they don't need to just have, a secret ballot. They need to be convinced of the secret ballot. And so she is basically preparing the ground to explain that you need to do some publicity efforts to convince people that your vote is free and fair in order for it to be free and fair. So that's the kind of, this is the high point, I guess, of her, the creation of her normative principles in her 1933 book. And again, the story could be left off there were it not for a plebiscite that had been written into the Paris Peace Conference, into the Versailles Treaty, which Sarah Wambaugh gets involved in. And this is this first moment that I think is worth thinking about that stands out a bit. This is the Saar plebiscite of 1935. And so the Saar is this industrial area abutting Alsace and Lorraine, but between France and Germany. And France had taken this after the First World War and wanted to seize it. But in the end, after the negotiations, American and British pressure, it was decided that France could have the coal mines, the important coal mines of this region, but they couldn't just take the territory. So instead, the League of Nations would run this territory for 15 years. And this is what happens. The League administration is going to last until 1935, and then written into the Versailles Treaty is a plebiscite, is a vote whether the population wants to go for France, Germany, or continue the League status quo, the administration of the League of Nations. And until 1933, it is very clear to everyone that, well, these are German-speaking people. They've always been German. They're not going to vote for France for sure. They probably don't want the League. So it's very clear they're going to vote for Germany. But then the importance of this vote, and even people's thinking about it, changes with the rise of Hitler. So once Adolf Hitler takes power in the beginning of 1933, suddenly this forthcoming vote gets a lot more high profile, and it's seen by liberal and exiled German oppositions and others around the world as somehow a test that this is going to be a referendum on Nazism, and that they see the status quo, continuing League administration, as a vote for Nazism, against Nazism rather. No one obviously thinks that Germans are going to vote for France, but they think voting for the League might be a riposte to Hitler. And the fact that the Saar had a very strong influence by the Catholic Church lends some support to these hopes. So there is a lot, in some people's mind, a lot riding on this plebiscite. But of course, the campaign is very one-sided. You have the status quo supporters are effectively refugee exiles from Germany. They don't have any financial support on their side. They're quite disorganized and of course, split between various factions. Whereas on the German side, they've been preparing for this vote to go back to Germany anyway for 15 years. And after 1933, they're getting a lot more direct financial support. And there's a group called the Deutsche Front, which are the advocates for this. And increasingly, they become, aligned with the Nazi Party. And so there's a mismatch between these two sides, even though there are still people who are hoping that this vote will somehow demonstrate that, Germans were rejecting Nazism. So why is Sarah Wambaugh involved? Well, she is made the deputy plebiscite commissioner as well as the technical advisor. And this is not surprising given the body of work she's produced on the plebiscite, but also she has a lot of connections in the League. And they're very happy to appoint her as technical advisor. They are reluctant. She wants to be a plebiscite commissioner, but in the end, there is gender bias against her. And they said, well, we'll make you deputy plebiscite commissioner. So the three gentlemen you see are from the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Sweden. And they are the three plebiscite commissioners who really don't have much knowledge of plebiscites, and they rely increasingly on Sarah Wambaugh, whose knowledge is, at this point, she is the expert in the world on running the plebiscite. And she basically includes all of her 18 points that she had created as the normative peak of her operation, and she includes pretty much all of them. Some of them have already been there in the form of League administration. But this is seen by her as a model plebiscite, a model of the safeguards needed. By the end of the preparations for the plebiscite, there is an international force as well, the first, what some scholars point to as the kind of protean peacekeeping force. But Wambaugh is more than just technical advisor. As the operation goes on, as it gets controversial, and as people are worried about whether this is going to be perceived as fair, she takes the lead in basically conducting interviews and press campaigns and radio broadcasts. And you've still got lots of transcripts of this in her files about she's talking to CBS and American broadcasters and newspaper journalists all over. And she's basically putting to good use all of her experience as a suffrage campaigner. And so she has experience in Tacna Arica, of course, but also beforehand in the women's peace movement and suffrage movements, how to run a publicity campaign. Something that actually her background in the women's movement gives her a great more deal of experience than, say, the other gentlemen members of the Plebiscite Commission. As part of this, she herself becomes a fairly recognized figure. There's lots of newspaper reporting on her in 1934 and 1935. And basically, all of it is full of admiration. So she is praised as this kind of technical mastermind. They're usually fairly formulaic. They say that, the men writing these reports say like, oh, I was so surprised that a woman would be doing this kind of thing. But we're really impressed and amazed at the same time. So obviously there's some gendered, aspects to this reporting, but her technical prowess is such that it overrides these perspectives. And she is really seen as a figure of admiration during this time. What happens in the vote? Well, Germany wins 90%. Hands down, they win. Everyone had kind of expected them to win, but it's a bit awkward because all of the anti-Hitler forces had suggested this was a referendum on Nazism. For Sarah Wambaugh, in her last book on plebiscites, which she publishes in 1940, but even in the days after in newspaper interviews and so on, she doesn't even focus on the political result. She says, it doesn't matter who wins this plebiscite. It's the fact that it was held is a triumph for League of Nations cooperation. It's a triumph for liberal internationalism. And it's a triumph for the kind of technical work of the League. And she admits that there was some Nazi pressure and some things weren't ideal, but she is adamant that, there was a secret ballot. So regardless of this kind of situation in the territory, the tension there, the fact that, there's lots of people giving the Hitler salute and all of these things, that the psychological pressure, at least they could vote freely. And so this narrative of the Saar plebiscite is one that is still basically with us, this idea that it was a technical success. But there are, of course, different perspectives on this. In liberal democratic countries, it's seen as now a triumph for peace. So the plebiscite is seen as this achievement in bringing amity to the world. France and Germany no longer have a point of tension. And this is seen as a triumph. And Sarah Wambaugh is lauded. She wins lots of, honorary degrees after this achievement. But in Nazi Germany, it's seen as another kind of triumph. It's a triumph for the regime. It's a triumph for, unifying Germany step by step, unifying the German-speaking peoples. And this all comes to a head in 1938. So a few short years after the Saar plebiscite, there is the Munich crisis. And if you read the diplomacy of this, the Saar plebiscite is used frequently as a precedent. Wambaugh's works are cited. They're looked through by the Foreign Office, for example, in Britain, who decide that a plebiscite is impossible. But regardless of this, the stature of the Saar plebiscite is such that it literally gets written into the Munich Agreement. And they suggest that they can resolve the tension of the Sudetenland by taking as a basis the conditions of the Saar plebiscite for plebiscites they're planning to hold in the Sudetenland. Of course, there are no plebiscites in the Sudetenland. It's very clear after 1938, after the Munich crisis, and the Munich Agreement, that it's not going to happen. The Czechs don't want to have a plebiscite, but regardless, the plebiscite, you could argue, the Saar plebiscite is seen as, an important vector, I guess you could argue, of appeasement. After this, unsurprisingly, the Saar plebiscites in general get tied up with appeasement. The reputation suffers catastrophically. And so the plebiscite falls out of favor just as quickly as it had risen again after the First World War. And with this, Sarah Wambaugh's reputation suffers too. And you might think that is, again, the end of the story, but there's one last element which I'll briefly cover, and that is after the war, suddenly Sarah Wambaugh and her expertise return. She is needed once again, and this is when her expertise in plebiscites over sovereignty gets used for domestic election monitoring. And this is her role in the Allied Mission for the Observation of Greek Elections, which is called AMFOG, in 1946. And I'm afraid I've probably timed this a little bad. I don't have a lot of time to go into the depths of the complexities of Greek politics at this time, but Greece is a country that has suffered, a long period of dictatorship and then German invasion and then, civil war, tension between right and left. It is a very fragile, post-conflict society. And this mission comes about after self-determination is kind of rethought of in a domestic sense. And so in the Atlantic Charter, the Declaration on Liberated Europe, America and other Western countries lead the way in saying, we're going to basically promote self-determination, that countries should be able to choose their own political destinies domestically. And part of that is this Greek election mission. Sarah Wambaugh's expertise gets used by this. She's actually referred to this role by Franklin Roosevelt just shortly before he dies. And he suggests her name as something useful for this. And it's interesting, this mission, primarily because it's actually an inversion of her expertise. So in this mission, the Americans don't prioritize her knowledge of plebiscites. Actually, they prioritize scientific sampling. And they say we can scientifically conduct polls just with a sample of populations to determine their political, affiliation and why they might vote or not vote and so on. The mission focuses on this, while Wambaugh is basically there saying, hey, we should be careful because not everything that our officials know might, be the case. And she makes a remarkable admission during this Greek election mission in 1946, where she says, actually, the plebiscite in the Tsar wasn't really perfect. And in fact, the people, our operation, we didn't know what was going on. And so she makes this admission 10 years, 11 years after the Tsar plebiscite, saying that all of the technical apparatus that we held, actually, this was still a fairly, flawed operation, that we turned our eyes to some of the pressure that the Nazis were putting on, and that we need to be more careful of the kind of underhand ways that can influence an election. She's largely ignored. The left wing in this election abstains from the vote. And so the mission, however, plays this down. They say the left, could have voted, it's not, there was nothing wrong with the election. Basically, it legitimizes the rather extreme right wing that comes to power as a result of this mission. And it ends in civil war. So after this election, already the first kind of tension, physical violence takes place at Litokoro in Greece, there on the map. And soon the country is spiraling into civil war as a result of this election. What is interesting about this is actually for Sarah Wambaugh that she is actually silent. And so you can see that she learns some political lessons maybe a little too carefully. One is that this election doesn't include women. Greece doesn't have female suffrage at this time. And it's remarkable that she doesn't mention a single word about this as criticism. And in fact, she writes a letter to one of her friends, a judge, Dorothy Kenyon, who is sympathizing with the left wing, her friend, and she writes back very vehemently that no, I deliberately didn't criticize the fact that there's no women voting because she didn't want to give any excuse for the communist sympathizers. And so in this point, she really becomes a kind of a very stark anti-communist, and she supports the Truman Doctrine, and she basically, in the last years of her life, the last 9 years of her life, writes vehement, tracts against the Soviet Union. She becomes really, political, you could say. She gives up the last pretense of her impartiality that she had tried to kind of cling to. And so it's a poignant moment looking at this arc of a political scientist, how she sort of changes, you could say. She learns some political realist lessons. During the Tsar plebiscite, she was maybe neutral. She didn't try and realize the implications of this neutrality might lead to a totalitarian government taking power. In the election mission in Greece, however, she's very political. She's deliberately, not criticizing this. She's supporting the right-wing government, and she's supporting the arguments that are underpinning that government. So she might lose her idealistic, youthful sense of kind of scientific impartiality. I will wrap up. She passes away in November 1955. This is kind of the Greek election mission is the kind of end point. She is technical advisor to the Kashmir plebiscite in the UN, which never holds it, but she is nominated for that position. But this is really the kind of bookend of her career. And so some very general conclusions quickly. Well, she led a very remarkable life. She broke through a lot of paternalistic prejudice. She also faced constraints by this. For a political scientist, she had a remarkably influential life. Her books and ideas were read by others in power. Even if they were consciously ignored at times, they still shaped the norms of what a successful plebiscite would be like. It also speaks to the idea of matter, ideas and perception. So the plebiscite was not just a technical tool, it was something that had a lot of perception tied to it, whether it was after the First World War perceived to be a failed idea, or then it was rehabilitated thanks to Sarah Wambaugh. That's something unique. And then, of course, the story points to this problem that technical focus might blind people to political realities. The Tsar plebiscite was seen by Wambaugh as a technical triumph, but in fact, it was also a political triumph for Nazism, and she kind of refused to admit this or see this until arguably it was too late. And then arguably she learned that lesson, that kind of realist lesson too well. In her final major work in the Greek elections, she abandons her commitment to neutrality altogether, and rather poignantly for someone involved in the women's suffrage movement, even abandons her commitment to women's suffrage at the end. So you see a kind of story arc of maybe Sarah Wambaugh's life and career. I will leave it there because I think I'm running out of time, but the book is coming in the next few months. So please do have a look if you're interested. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was wonderful. And yeah, I learned quite a bit from it. We do have time for a question or two.
Can I
Sure.
leap in with two? I'll make them very, very quick.
Sure.
Andrew, that was fascinating and certainly gave me some insights into the Tsar plebiscite that I wasn't aware of previously. I guess I have two quick questions. The first one is, can we see her failure and the failure of the legitimacy of plebiscites in the massive population transfers we see after the Second World War and the sort of absence of plebiscites there? And the other question was, in a sense, plebiscites are a very blunt, majoritarian sort of approach to the problem of minorities. Given that she also worked within the League of Nations, in that area of minorities, in the time when things like the minority treaties were being formulated, does she ever consider alternative solutions to this problem of divided areas?
Yes, so I glossed over it a little bit in this presentation. She does, her thought changes on this, and so to take the case of minorities, in her first book on plebiscites, she's very dismissive about the problem. She mentions that, well, it might be that a plebiscite results in enclaves, a political enclave of a minority, but that's fine. If we give them some minority rights, it'll be fine. There's no issue. By the Second World War, of course, she's totally rethought this. And actually, she herself comes during the war to get very close to actually condemning the plebiscite itself. She even writes a newspaper article saying that there are better ways to deal with minorities than promoting than letting them vote and secede. And she actually advocates population transfer by the last years of her life. So
Right.
she praises the Greek-Turkish population transfer in part because the League of Nations had run it, and she says, the League did it, so it must have been successful. So it is a kind of, in one sense, this arc. She goes from idealist to really very, she really kind of loses some of her original ideas for that. But in terms of minorities per se, she was also a little bit blinkered by this at first. That said, the main quite prescient thing she did advocate for is when she visited these plebiscite zones after the operation, she visited the Upper Silesia, which had the League of Nations implemented this 15-year regime of basically that territory was economically united, even though it was split between Poland and Germany. And she advocates this as an example of how the future of the world is going to be. And that's actually quite forward thinking because even Jean Monnet at that time, he's a League of Nations official as well,
Mm.
involved in that operation. He doesn't even in his memoirs think that that was really a precedent. So Sarah Wambaugh does pick up on this precedent of it would be stretching it to say a precedent for the European Union, but she calls, at least in the early 1920s, saying, look, a better solution to these minority troubles is to leave it economically united, give them a kind of, basically integrate their economies, don't have that kind of tension. So that is one thing that she does advocate, and she's consistent in that. She does advocate that in the 1940s as well. Yeah. I can't recall. What was your other
Whether
question?
the massive population transfers at the
Yeah.
end of the Second World War mark the ultimate failure of
Yeah.
these kinds of
So
things.
so I don't know. Well, they were definitely related. So when I looked into the American archives about planning for the post Second World War order, the plebiscite is very dismissed. There's a few references, but all the talk is on population transfer. And so if there was any advocacy for the plebiscite, it was, the reputation was so bad after 1939 that it really didn't get much look in. I know that, Roosevelt had Project M, it was called, Project Migration, and he had a lot of efforts focusing on that. It was just seen as an easier tool for policymakers because it's easier to just forcibly move people than, have them vote because it seemed that the plebiscites resulted in lots of, chaos and so on. What one interesting thing, just briefly, is in those discussions, they did, however, see a useful role for one aspect of the plebiscite, which was the international forces to keep order. They kind of split that off and they focus on that almost as a peacekeeping sense, saying, well, although the plebiscites might have been a bit violent, the idea of getting multinational troops together to maintain order, that was quite useful. And we could do that after the Second World War. So there is that element that the policymakers do take away from it.
Cool. Thank you. That's really interesting.
My
Well,
pleasure.
well, we are a little over time, so we might wrap it up there. Please join me again in thanking Andrew. And yes, thank you for joining us all the way from Hong Kong. So before we close up, I just want to remind everybody one more talk before our second term break, and that'll be next Friday. We'll have Professor Greta Hawes from Macquarie University, who'll be talking about digital humanities in classics, in particular her Manto mythology project, her database on different references to ancient myths. So it'll be a fascinating talk for whether or not you're interested in ancient history or digital humanities, and it's all those possibilities. It'll be great, I think, to come along to. Thanks again, everybody, and we will see you next week.